Hey, you guys, it's Kim. Welcome back to The Control Variable. So it's the end of summer here in upstate New York. It's that last lazy stretch of summer before everyone heads back to school. Times are still wild here in America, of course, but it's like the late summer version of wild times. A lot of my life feels pretty good these days. I spent last week in the mountains up north, toasted some s'mores, swam in a lake. I really only have two problems right now. One is my brain, which somehow always finds a way to freak out, no matter how good my vacation is. The other is America, this beautiful, crazy-ass country of ours, and the question of how to keep living in it. So recently, the thing about America that's been haunting me the most is the climate crisis. I think it's because I'm trying to live more responsibly, drive less, shop less, eat less meat, do my part to keep the planet from going up in flames. And it's not always easy. It turns out some of my oldest, most deeply irresponsible American dreams really don't want to die. And I find myself wondering if that's the case for a lot of us. I grew up here, reading American magazines, watching American movies, listening to American Top 40 on the radio, basically inhaling our mainstream culture. So for a lot of my life, my dreams have been pretty mainstream American dreams. I dreamed of working hard, becoming rich and famous, falling in love, living in a big fancy house with a big fancy car, a pool, a closet full of shoes. I dreamed at some point I'd get married, have a family, move to an even bigger house, buy a boat, some more cars, some more shoes, maybe a summer place by the ocean. You get the picture. They're shopping dreams, really, when it comes down to it. Dreams about stuff, bigger and better stuff, fancier stuff, new and improved stuff. I didn't ever dream about growing up and cutting back, living more simply when I was a kid. This was America, right? It was all supposed to just keep getting bigger and better. And the thing is, these dreams weren't unusual in the suburbs where I grew up. They were white suburbs. Most kids I knew had similar dreams. Hollywood told us America was a place where anyone who worked hard was going to get rich. Walt Disney sang to us, when you wish upon a star, your dreams come true. And for a lot of my life, those dreams were a lot about shopping. And up until pretty recently, there didn't seem to be anything wrong with those dreams. Yes, we had periods of reckoning. 9/11 was a reckoning. The subprime mortgage crisis was a reckoning. But let's face it, the last 6 or 7 years since Donald Trump was elected, those have been a beast of a whole other order. They've made us ask ourselves really deep questions, serious questions about our dreams, our values, what it's all for. I don't think it's really possible to be alive in America right now and not wonder pretty regularly how we're supposed to be living. And then there's the pandemic, right? And I don't care who you are. These last 2.5 years have been crazy. Because it's not just the pandemic. It's all the things that bubbled up along with the pandemic. The racial and social injustices in our country. The Black Lives Matter movement. The looming homelessness. The attack on the Capitol on January 6th. The wildfires. The floods. The endless school shootings. Shit has gotten real. So I think a lot these days about how I might live in a way that's both joyful and responsible. A way that feels good for me and for the planet. I'm still not that good at it. I still find myself sitting up trolling the internet way past midnight, wondering if the key to happiness might just be a really great pair of stilettos. It's a process. However, unlike me, my guest on today's show, the writer and environmentalist Bill McKibben, is very good at living joyfully and responsibly. He saw the climate crisis coming way before the rest of us, like back when Reagan was elected. Bill was only 20 at the time. He was still in college, but he knew. He looked into America's future and saw the climate crisis writ large. He wrote a book about it called The End of Nature all the way back in 1989. This was the first mainstream book ever about global warming. And he's basically spent his whole life trying to warn the rest of us about it, trying to get us to believe him, show us how to live in smaller, more wholehearted ways, how to live closer to nature, take better care of each other, and this incredible planet of ours. Unfortunately, we haven't really listened. Hollywood is big and loud. The internet is somehow even bigger and even louder. But Bill McKibben is still out there fighting for us. And he's here to talk to us today about his latest book, a memoir called The Flag, the Cross, and the Station Wagon. Wait for it. A graying American looks back at his suburban boyhood and wonders, what the hell happened? So yeah, it's not exactly a beach read, but it is a really important read. Because in it, Bill McKibben, who grew up like a lot of us in the suburbs, believing America was the greatest country in the world, looks honestly at how things got to be so screwed up here. How white people got to be so much richer and more educated than Black people. How that disparity has led to widespread isolation and depression and environmental devastation for all of us, across the board. But here's the thing I find really fascinating about Bill McKibben. The guy just doesn't stop, like ever. He looks at the hardest, darkest truths you can imagine and then thinks hard about what good solutions might be. He's also insanely brilliant. The guy became a New Yorker staff writer at like 22. He kind of knows everything about everything: climate change, American history, politics, you name it. He's written 20 books, including the bestsellers Falter, Deep Economy, and The End of Nature. He's the Schumann Distinguished Scholar at Middlebury College. He's gone to jail for his activism a dozen times. He's actually spent the night there. And he's the founder of not one, but two climate action organizations. One is 350.org, which aims to end the age of fossil fuels. The other is the recently formed Third Act, which is kind of tailor-made for folks over 60. Basically all you boomers out there. So this whole time we've been out chasing our dreams of a beautiful, perfect life and endless wealth and endless fame and endless stuff. Bill McKibben's been thinking and writing about what a healthier, more wholehearted, responsible American dream might look like. One that might actually feel as good as it looks. And we're lucky enough to have him here today to tell us about it. So here's my talk with Bill. First of all, I really wanted to say thank you so much. I'm a huge admirer of yours.
Well, it's great fun for me too. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I really love the book. I had a similar sort of white upper middle class suburban upbringing, and in Bronxville, New York, which is Westchester. And so you're writing a lot about things that I thought about during the pandemic and all of the racial upheaval and just all of the upheaval that we've had in this country for the last several years. And I just wondered, with this memoir, you've said that you never thought you would write a memoir. So I was curious about what sort of changed your mind.
Yeah. I'd always assumed there was no point in me writing a memoir because I really have had as ordinary in many ways a life as it's possible to have, especially in my youth in the suburbs, as standard issue as it comes, with a loving family and no particular traumas and so on and so forth. But at a certain point, it became clear to me that that very ordinariness was actually interesting, at least to me, and significant, that it was in those seemingly very ordinary places that in many ways the fate of the next 50 years was determined. But the idea grew, and I mean, it's not really a memoir. There's a little bit of memoir in it, but mostly it's, an essay and some reporting about who we are and where we are now and how we got there. But Lexington was a very lucky place for me to have landed because it adds immeasurably to the story. Lexington's such an interesting town because it was the first battle of the American Revolution. And it was, I spent my summers giving tours of the battle green. And so there's a whole entree into American history. But also, as I describe early in the book, it was a kind of locus for protest, in this case for the Vietnam veterans against the war. And so a kind of entree into that particular moment in time, too, that epic moment of cultural, social, political transformation that marked the late 60s and the early 70s.
So you kind of had those two threads sort of going from early on, it seems to me,
That's right.
Planted in you early on.
I got interested in how that optimism vanished as the decade of the 70s wore on, and how by its end we were beginning down the path of sort of hyper-individualism and division that was marked by the election of Ronald Reagan, but that has continued to dominate our political and, I think, our cultural life ever since.
Yeah, so tell me about that. How do you see us as having gone from sort of this very idealistic time in American history to a much more markedly self-centered time?
Well, America coming out of the Depression and the Second World War was a place of great unity with enormous flaws, which the movements of the 60s did much to try and fix. But at a certain point, we either ran out of energy or decided we'd fixed enough of those problems, or the wealth we were creating, and this is really I think my theory above all, the wealth we were creating and these suburbs we were building, which a suburb is simply a series of bigger houses farther apart from each other, was breaking down that sense of solidarity. and increasing that sense of every man and woman for themselves. And, at best, every family for themselves. And at a certain point, the balance between those two models of how to live in the world just tipped. And for me, the symbolic tipping point anyway was the Carter-Reagan election of 1980, which was pretty clearly a choice between a kind of view of the world where we looked out for each other and a view of the world where we looked out for ourselves.
How did it happen that the suburbs became this bizarre sort of toxic mushroom that grew up all over the country? And I wondered if you had thought at all about the advertising piece of it.
I mean, a key part of this, and it goes directly to what you're saying, I mean, the key invention that enabled all of this was, of course, the automobile. And we had them pre-war in this country, but not that many. And then they just exploded. And that's, of course, what the advertisers were cut their teeth on. That was the most advertised of all products, and the one that came with the very quickly with the fewest ties to the actual product. It wasn't long before advertising of cars was essentially the advertising of the girls you could get if you had the right car or whatever. All the car companies had immediately at the beginning of World War II gone into material production, and very, very fast. And I mean, the entire auto parts assembly chain, the guys who were making seat belts and seat covers were suddenly making parachute cords, and, on and on and on. After World War II, they needed to keep that going. And of course, these were important players in our nation's political life, and on and on and on. The whole thing had a kind of self-perpetuating momentum. So the big public project of the 1950s, of course, was the construction of the interstate highway system, itself marketed as a defense initiative because all the highways were laid out so you could land huge planes on them if you had to, and so on and so forth. And the suburb was just literally built around the car. The dimensions of cul-de-sacs, driveways, houses, a result of what the turning radius of cars were. That's how every single thing in those places was engineered. And completely insupportable as a landscape without a car. You can't walk them. They're not designed. Most of them don't even have sidewalks, So part of what happened, of course, in the 1970s, with tremendous echoes to what's happening today, is that suddenly the price of gasoline went straight through the roof. We had a series of oil shocks, and that was the most dramatic thing in many ways in people's lives in that decade. As a young newspaper reporter, I was covering those gas crises in Lexington. And, my job was just calling around to gas stations to find out what few hours of the week they'd be open. And that really shook people up. That was one of these things that made people a little less idealistic and other-minded than they'd been before.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that stayed with me a lot while I was reading your book was just this sense of a real shift from sort of a kind of idealism to really deep-seated cynicism. But you don't talk about cynicism that much. And I wondered, I mean, you talk around it a lot. And I just wondered if you think that's the appropriate word for the result of the choices that our country has made, and like the psychology that the sort of a lot of white middle-class America has ended up with.
Yeah, I think that and I think certainly that some of the choices that we made were cynical. I describe in the book early on in Lexington this decision in a referendum not to allow even a small affordable housing development in town. And I think it was driven by people's fear that it might do something to their property values. I don't think it was driven by a kind of classic racism, although, as we now understand, racism is a more complicated phenomenon than we might once have thought. But it was definitely driven by the thought that undesirable people might produce undesirable consequences for the price of your home. People put fairly sharp limits, as it turns out, on how much they were willing to think about others as opposed to how much they were willing to think about themselves. I mean, the irony of all of this, of course, is that we've ended up producing a world that doesn't work very well for any of us or many of us at the moment. A world that's sharply unequal and with all the things that entails, and a world that's careening out of control physically. Its temperature rising very fast with ominous implications for everyone.
Well, something that I found really interesting in your book is that you make the argument, and really convincing argument with a lot of statistics about how close actually America came to having a very different future, in the sense that, right, 2 weeks before the Carter-Reagan election, Carter was still leading in the polls. And it sounds like there was quite a thin shave with a bunch of these large and echoing decisions that were made. And I wondered if you can just talk about that a little bit and why you think it shook out like that.
I think the best example is around energy. Carter had pledged, running for president in 1980, and put in his budget a plan that would have had the U.S. producing 20% of its power from solar energy by the year 2000. Had we done that or anything like it, we would be in an entirely different situation dealing with climate change, this existential threat that now looms over us. It would never have gotten anywhere near as bad, and we would be well on the way to solving it, because we would know we would be well experienced now in producing power without coal and oil and gas. But instead, Ronald Reagan metaphorically climbed up onto the roof of the White House and took down the solar panels that Jimmy Carter had put up the year before and put us on a completely different path.
What exactly happened in those last 2 weeks before the election to vault Reagan into the White House?
I mean, remember, there were a lot of things going on, the Iran hostage crisis and so on. But in the end, Reagan's message, you don't have to sacrifice, you don't have to change, you're free to indulge the selfish side of you, that won out. It turned out that that's what people really wanted. I mean, in that sense, democracy worked all too well.
I just want to pull us back to advertising and propaganda there for a minute, because I increasingly see that and so much of these like sort of national mindsets that we're dealing with in America right now as like literally like a narrative that was fed to people, the narrative of desire. And like, you can live your dreams, you can experience freedom if you buy this car, and you can have happiness if you get this house and all this. I mean, I literally see this industry that has very consciously told people a story about what their lives should be like and given people these weird definitions about freedom and happiness and liberty that are just have been warped so horribly by politicians and people involved in the markets.
Yes. Carter was interesting because he was by far our most philosophical president in this regard. And he kept giving speeches about telling people, you really can't satisfy your desire for meaning by buying more stuff, and consumption isn't doing what we think it should. And he had E.F. Schumacher, who'd written Small is Beautiful, over to the White House for a reception, and so on and so forth. And of course that was completely contrary to precisely the force that in our life that you're describing, the huge industry, this sort of meta industry of consumer capitalism, whose job is to convince us that we can solve our problems by buying more things. This was at the absolute height of the advertising. Now from that era looks kind of crude to us because we've gotten better at the kind of manipulation and things, but it worked then just fine.
I just want to go back for a second to this sort of idea of hyper-individualism and our lack of community. I wondered if there were any other kind of things that specifically drove it home, like whether it's statistics or just examples from that you've observed in your own life of where you get the strong sense of unhappiness in America.
You can do it even in just crude statistical ways. American life expectancy has been declining the last 4 or 5 years now, which is something that would be entirely impossible for people to have imagined in 1960 or 1970. And these are largely what the epidemiologists call deaths of despair. It's the fact that we have high levels of opioid addiction, high levels of disordered eating, on and on and on, none of which are the product of people in a happy, contented, sensible place, right? All of which are kind of the markers of breakdown of working, functioning communities.
Yeah, and I was just also going to add to that, just this sort of epidemic of teenage depression that we're dealing with.
Exactly right. And of course, we have, in my lifetime, one more incredibly potent tool for that kind of individualization and privatization of life, And that's the, 4-inch rectangle of glass that everybody's holding in their palm at all times.
Something that really struck me is there's an illustration in the book about, someone in Bangladesh ending up having 3 dead horses that's directly correlated to someone having 3 cars in their garage in America. Did I get that right?
Yeah, pretty much.
Pretty much, right?
Close enough.
Close enough. But so that to me, right, I get that. And yet I am struck by how many Americans don't seem to make that connection. And I mean, because the young people do seem to be making that connection. And I wonder what we can do to get more people to engage in making that kind of,
Right. Well, me too. I mean, that is what I've been wondering about and working on for 20 some years now. And with some success. I mean, there was no climate movement when we began. I started a thing called 350.org with 7 college students. And we've now organized 20,000 rallies in every country on earth except North Korea. And we spearheaded this fight over the Keystone Pipeline that was big oil's first big defeat. And then we started this fossil fuel divestment campaign that's now at $40 trillion in endowments and pensions and portfolios that have sold off their coal and oil and gas stocks. And, people have emerged to do fantastic work, a lot of them young people, including the people that everyone knows about and should. Greta Thunberg, who's wonderful, one of my favorite people to work with in the world, and the 10,000 other Greta Thunbergs around the planet and the 10 million kids that are following them. And so that's dramatic and wonderful work. I began to worry at some point, Kim, that everybody was just counting on kids to do this work entirely.
Yeah.
Like in between field hockey practice and Spanish homework, might you also save the world,
Yeah.
And not only is that ignoble, it also seems highly impractical. Kids have all the intelligence and energy and idealism that they need, but they lack the structural power. So I began plotting to see if perhaps we could get people like me who are over the age of 60 engaged in some of this work. And really the thinking goes back to precisely what we were discussing at the beginning of this conversation. If you're in your 60s or 70s or 80s now, the first act of your life, you were around for this epic period of cultural, social, political transformation. Maybe you participated in it, because lots of people did. The first Earth Day in 1970 had about 20 million Americans out in the streets, 10% of the then population. And I wager most of those people are still alive because they were young. But even if you didn't participate in it, at least you bore witness to it. And that provides a kind of historical DNA for this generation. Now, look, in our second act, for all the reasons that you've been describing, and with plenty of noble exceptions, people were more interested in consumerism than they were in citizenship. But that water has flowed under the bridge, and now people emerge at their third act with resources. People over the age of 60 have 70% of the country's money, compared with about 5% for millennials. We have skills acquired over a lifetime. Maybe we have time now that we didn't before. And most of us have kids or grandkids that take this abstract idea of legacy and make it quite concrete. I mean, legacy means, what kind of world am I leaving the people I love the most? And the answer to that at the moment is, we're leaving a world that's worse than the one we were born into, which is a novel thing to be doing and not at all what people mostly hope for. So we're seeing if we can draw on that original historical DNA for these generations to re-excite people. And that's why we formed Third Act.
So how's it going?
It's going good. It's young, but tens of thousands of people have signed up, and they've doing big campaigns to try and pressure the banks to stop lending to the fossil fuel industry.
Yeah, I had no idea about Chase Bank. I'm going to leave Chase Bank. I didn't know.
Yeah. Don't do it on your own. It doesn't do any good to do any of this on your own, because, Kim, unless you're extremely wealthy,
I'm not.
It's possible Chase Bank might not notice that you had left.
They won't notice. They won't care.
But that's why we do these things together. So, in fact, that's this goes to another thing we've been talking about. especially maybe in this work of social change, trying to be a good American individualist doesn't work. We're past the point where we can solve the climate crisis one Tesla at a time. The most important thing an individual can do is be a little less of an individual and join together with others in movements large enough to help.
Just for the sake of full information, will you explain to people why, I mean, we're just calling out Chase here, but why specifically these big banks are a problem?
Chase City, Wells Fargo, and Bank of America, the four big American banks, are also the four biggest lenders to the fossil fuel industry. They've lent them more than $1 trillion since the Paris Climate Accords were signed. They didn't need Donald Trump to sabotage those accords. They were happy to do it themselves and provide the capital for endless new pipelines and fracking wells and all the things that scientists have told us we have got to stop doing now if we have any hope of reaching those targets we set at Paris. We can't turn off the supply of oil and gas overnight, sadly, mostly because we wasted the last 30 years, but we can stop the expansion of this industry so that all the new capacity that's coming on comes from the sun and the wind, which are now the cheapest ways to produce power in this world.
So the thing is that they are now, so clean energy is now the cheapest way to produce energy in the world. And yet at the same time, changing the infrastructure is going to be gigantically expensive, which I think makes people nervous. And so I don't know, I wonder what you'd say about that.
Well, I mean, yes, it'll take some money to switch us over, but all the calculations show that taken as a whole, you save lots of money and pretty quickly. And the reason, if you think about it, is clear. Yeah, it takes some money to put up a solar panel, but once you put the panel up, then the sun delivers the energy for free every morning when it rises above the horizon. And that's the reason that the Exxons of the world hate this business model so much, because they've made their fortune by having you write them another check every single month for your entire life for another, boatload of gas or oil or coal. In fact, speaking of boatloads, 40% of all the ship traffic on planet Earth turns out to be just moving coal and gas and oil back and forth. So if we were just letting the sun and the wind deliver that energy for us, we could put half the boats in the world out of business, So the possibilities are quite remarkable. It's not easy. It's the hardest thing we've ever done to make this transition, but it's not impossible either. The technological and financial obstacles are much smaller than they were. The obstacles are mostly about vested interest.
I wanted to be an environmental journalist after college, and there just was no appetite for it. And I have to say that I lived in New York and I ended up becoming a different kind of journalist, and life went on, right? It was very disappointing. And I do feel like the pandemic the combination of the pandemic and increased awareness of climate change and just the sense of just the whole planet really melting down in a lot of ways, it got me to re-engage in a way in the last few years that I really wouldn't necessarily have expected. I guess I'm hopeful that maybe I'm not alone in that for a lot of people, these last years have been pretty profoundly shifting.
I think you're not alone in it. All the polling data indicates that people are becoming far, far more concerned. And why wouldn't they be? Because now we've got forest fires and floods and all the things we said were going to happen now are happening. And so it's no wonder that people are paying attention and seeing it. But there's also just a strong generational sense of sadness and futility, especially for very young people. And that's very, very hard to watch. The polling indicates that something like 90% of young people say that they may not decide to have kids because their fear of the climate crisis has reached the point where they hesitate to bring someone into this world. That's about as stark as it gets in human terms.
But then it also seems like, I don't know, it also seems like guilt can really paralyze people, right? And I don't know, maybe guilt does activate some people, but I guess it does seem like somehow you have to get past guilt.
Yes. There's a huge amount of people writing and talking and stuff about climate optimism and pessimism and anxiety and despair, all of which I get and understand. In my work over many decades, since I wrote the first book about all of this, I guess I've had as long a career of thinking about it as anybody. I just default towards a kind of basic, tell people the truth. and let them work from there. You tell people the truth about what's going on, but also tell them the truth about what can be done. And if you provide people with plausible ways to make change on a scale that counts, not to change their light bulb, but to change their senator or to change their whatever, then I think people can, for the most part, cope with where we find ourselves. And it's one of the reasons we organize. It's one of the reasons we set things up like Third Act, because there's a big desire for people to do something.
I mean, you make this sort of very beautiful case actually about just actually that, you know, all the boomers and boomers plus, if everybody really would engage with this, that you guys can save the world.
Yeah, we can certainly get a long ways towards it. I do think our part at the moment is most about backing up the young people who are doing this work. And I get a little worried watching our political life that gerontocracy may not be the smartest way of organizing our affairs. And I'm sort of hopeful that there are some of the incredible younger people that I know will emerge in positions of real power sooner rather than later. But I'm very eager to have them heavily backed up by, and older people have an extraordinary role to play here, Kim. I mean, in America, there are 70 million people over the age of 60. That's bigger than the population of France, but multiply that by some other factor, because we all vote. I mean, there is no way to keep old people away from the polls. And so if you change, even by a small increment, who they're voting for or whatever, it has huge impact. So could be a decisive generation.
Tell me what's been your favorite day so far with Third Act?
Well, what's been fun is that people are approaching it in the right spirit. So, for instance, we've been doing these demonstrations outside banks, say Chase Bank, and often there'll be a crowd of young people. High school kids are often great climate organizers and very engaged. And by the way, extremely happy to see their elders also helping out here. So they'll be in front because they walk a little faster. But at the back, the last time when I was at, there's a big crowd of older people marching under a banner that said "Fossils against fossil fuels." It's like, okay, there's the right spirit. People have figured out not to take themselves overly seriously, and here's how we're going to do this.
Yeah, I love that. I want you to sketch for me, if you can, like what you can imagine the best case scenario being here, like what it would look like if we really start to rock this out and like get people really behind Third Act and get people really engaged in sort of building a better country in terms of racial justice and climate justice. And like, you know, the numbers, right? You know what that might look like if the ship started to turn. So I wonder how you would describe it, like what it would look like.
Well, so first thing to be said, of course, is climate change is the perfect reminder that even just doing things in one's own country is not going to be enough to solve the problems that we face. They don't call it global warming for nothing. But let's assume, since we organize around the world, that we're capable of making real change in a lot of places quickly. We're well past the point where we're going to stop climate change. That's not an option. What we're playing for now is trying to stop it as close to 2 degrees Celsius, 4 degrees Fahrenheit as possible. That's going to be a very difficult world, but perhaps not an impossible one. And in the course of doing it, making the changes we need to make, we may be doing some things that will produce a more happy and equitable world. So, for instance, replacing fossil fuel, coal and oil and gas, with sun and wind, that's necessary for carbon reasons, but it comes with other benefits. Coal and gas and oil are concentrated in a few places. So the people who live on top of those places or control them get all kinds of unearned power. That's the king of Saudi Arabia. That's the Koch brothers, who used our biggest oil and gas barons, who used their winnings to buy a political party and degrade our democracy. That's, at the moment, most painfully, Vladimir Putin, who's using his oil and gas revenues to terrorize Europe. And so it's not that there won't be rich people from sun and wind. There will, but as for reasons we've already talked about, they won't be that rich because the sun provides the energy for free. And instead, those things will be coming from much closer to home because sun and wind are ubiquitous on our planet. So we'll begin the kind of process of building a more small d democratic world with things more under our control. And hopefully that can expand in lots of other ways. And we can begin to break down some of these other very large and dysfunctional systems that aren't doing us much good. Our agricultural system, for instance, which is causing enormous environmental damage, but also turning us into a bunch of fatsos too, because it just feeds us cheap corn syrup because that's the most profitable thing to do. I do think that humans are interesting and complicated creatures, and that 100 years from now, it's very unlikely that we'll still be just amusing ourselves by buying stuff. I think if we can get through the bottleneck of the next 50 years, which is a very open question whether we're going to make it through that or not, I'm afraid. But if we can, that human societies will find lots of interesting ways to flourish. One of the books that I've read this year with pleasure is a book by the science fiction writer Kim Stanley Robinson called Ministry for the Future. And it opens with a very, very scary account of climate change. But then it's sort of about how societies rouse themselves to deal with that. And the stories, including the kind of love stories that it tells in the process, are affecting. Possibilities for human pleasure and happiness and delight and joy remain. And our job is to make a world where they're widespread.
Well, and I think we are just starting to understand, like we've been sort of, as I said, like I do think we've had these terms defined by capitalism and by a market-driven society. And I feel like there's actually so much more that those words can and actually do contain.
Absolutely. Absolutely. One of the things that, I don't know if it worries you, but it worries me, is that our relationships with screens are becoming so ubiquitous that it's difficult for us to break out of that kind of strange world. And I hope that that's one of the things that, it's certainly one of the reasons that we try to organize the ways we do, just to sort of give people some outlets from that and some things to do in the real world.
There's something about being with other bodies in a room that is just, screens just don't do it, right? They don't provide that same kind of communion that's possible and just kind of like sense of fellowship in a way.
Amen to that.
I was wondering, because you've been to jail over 30 times, is that right?
No, it's not that many times. God, I don't know how many, but not that many. A dozen maybe or something.
All right. Well, let's pretend we're having a beer. And I would love for you to crack open your beer and tell me your best jail story. What's your favorite or most interesting jail story?
Well, it's really remarkable to spend a few days in the American criminal justice system and start to realize just what a horrible trap it is. I spent 3 days, I guess, at Central Cell Block in D.C., which is exactly as much fun as it sounds like it would be. And they were trying to, a bunch of us it was the beginning of this fight over the Keystone Pipeline, and they were trying to deter all the other people from following us in subsequent days. So they kept us in jail for a long time, even though we weren't charged with much. On the day when they finally took us over to the courthouse, they chained you at the ankle to all the other prisoners who were going to the court that day. And then you had your hand on the shoulder of the guy in front. So the guy in front of me, he said, "What are you in for?" I said, "They charged us with failure to yield." And he said, "Damn, that's not even a misdemeanor. That's a traffic." He said, and I said, "What are you in for?" And he said, "Attempted murder."
Oh my God.
Like, oh, okay. Look, I knew I was going to get out and, all of that. I had every possible privilege that comes with, the world I've inhabited. But it was very useful to spend a few days seeing just what a broken and terrible world that is in there. People who don't have good lawyers, can't get representation, are just shuffled through a system that requires lots of prisoners to keep it going.
I mean, we could have a whole other conversation about about punishment and how one should treat criminals.
Yeah, but it was very useful to open one's eyes in that way. Usually when one gets arrested doing the kind of things that I do, your time in jail is brief. a day or something. And so I have lots of people now tell me that getting arrested is on their bucket list. I'm capable of helping them. And it is one of the great gifts of the 20th century was the invention of nonviolent civil disobedience. It came from the suffragists. It came from Gandhi. It came from Dr. King. It came from the margins. And it's a tool to allow people with relatively little power to stand up to institutions and forces of great power.
I wondered, what are you most proud of?
Of course, I'm most proud of my daughter, who's truly remarkable. But in the work that I've done, as a writer, I'm proud that I wrote the first book about what became the most important subject in the world. As an organizer, I'm proud that we built the first movement, sort of iteration of a global movement around climate change. But I'm less proud of the fact that we haven't won, that the temperature keeps going up, because that's not how these stories are supposed to end.
That's not over yet.
No, it's not. And that's what one hopes. But it's supposed to end with the good guys triumphing. And so far, that's not how this one's playing out. So we've got lots of work to do.
One more thing. What would you say is the biggest lesson that you've learned in this 40-year incredible career engaging in climate justice?
Well, there's two things. One is that there really are, if not people, then forces and institutions that are bad. I mean, the fossil fuel industry has been a force for evil over this period of time. And I didn't understand that when I was younger. But to counter it, the fact that people have within them an extraordinary amount of creativity. And when we started 350.org, it basically, it was that people described it as the first kind of open source movement. And it was, we were organizing in every country in the world, which meant we weren't really organizing at all. It was much more like a potluck supper. And we were just setting the dates and the themes, and everybody was doing their thing. And you know what? No one ever did anything wrong. Over thousands and thousands and thousands of iterations, people just brought their best selves to this project, and it's been beautiful to watch.
So that's Bill McKibben. I think he's kind of the closest thing we have to a living prophet here in America. And lucky for us, he says it's not too late. He says we can still turn this thing around, especially if the boomers get involved. Hear that, boomers? You guys have the power and the money to turn this thing around. Make a better world. Leave a better world for your grandkids. Yes, it's going to get hotter, but if we act together now, all of us, there is still so much we can save. To find out more about Third Act or donate, go to thirdact.org, thirdact.org. Thanks for joining me today on The Control Variable, you guys. See you next time. Guys, if you like the show, please be sure to go rate, review, and follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. It really helps. And be honest, okay? Tell us what you liked. Tell us what you didn't like, what annoyed the hell out of you, what you want to hear more of. I'll listen. I promise. We're in this together, okay? Let's make something amazing. The Control Variable is brought to you by Atomic Whale Studios and executive produced by Jonathan Wilson. The podcast was created by Jonathan, Brian Blatstein, and me. Brian Blatstein is the supervising producer. Rob Okendo and I are producers of the podcast. The technical producer and supervising editor is Derek Michaud of Shelby Rowe Productions. Sound editing is by Alex Aerosmith, and technical support is provided by Eric Totora Patu. Website creative direction by Randy Brasoff. Original music was composed and performed by Dan White. The Control Variable is managed by Sean Madison. Fact-checking by Kelly Stakopoulos. Megan Petta is our researcher, guest coordinator, and the person who keeps the Control Variable train on the tracks every day. Finally, I'm your writer and host, Kim Cutter. A very special thanks to everyone who made our show possible.